Dad texted, "Don't come around anymore. This is your brother's home now. We've changed the locks." I just replied, "Understood. But you forgot who's been paying property taxes since 2022. Then I logged in, canceled the autopay, and forwarded one email. A month later, I got a screenshot from my brother. "Why is there an eviction notice on the door?" I didn't respond, because by then, it was already up for sale. I, 34M, stared at the text message on my phone, reading it 3 times before the words actually sunk in. My father had just told me not to come around anymore, that this was my brother's home now, and they'd changed the locks. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been supporting that house financially for 3 years. When Dad got sick and couldn't work, when my younger brother moved back in after his divorce with 2 kids in tow, I'd stepped up without question. The property taxes, the insurance, the major repairs, all of it came out of my account while they lived there rent-free. My finger hovered over the keyboard as I crafted my response. I kept it simple and factual. I told him I understood, but reminded him who'd been paying the property taxes since 2022. Then I set my phone aside and walked to my laptop. The next 20 minutes changed everything. First, I logged into the county tax assessor's website and canceled the auto pay I'd set up 3 years ago. The system confirmed the cancellation immediately. Then I forwarded a single email, the property tax notice that had arrived in my inbox just 2 weeks earlier. The one showing $8,400 in annual taxes due in 60 days. I sent it to my father with a brief note explaining that since it was no longer my concern, he should handle it directly. The satisfaction I felt was cold and precise. They wanted me out of their lives? Fine. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail in their rush to push me aside. 1 month later, my brother's message came through as a screenshot. The image showed an official eviction notice taped to the front door of what used to be our family home. His text was panicked, asking why there was an eviction notice on the door. I looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. By that point, I'd already been in contact with a real estate agent for 2 weeks. Update 1. To understand how we got here, I need to go back to when Dad first got diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. That was 4 years ago, and the treatment was brutal. Between the chemo and radiation, he couldn't maintain his job at the manufacturing plant. The disability payments barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage and taxes on the 4-bedroom house where he'd raised us. My brother had just gone through a messy divorce and needed somewhere to stay with his 2 kids. The timing seemed perfect. He could help take care of Dad while I handled the finances from across town. I'd started my own consulting business 2 years earlier and was finally making decent money. The arrangement worked initially. I'd cover the big expenses, property taxes, insurance, major repairs, while my brother handled day-to-day care and contributed what he could from his part-time job. Dad's health stabilized after the first year of treatment, though he never returned to full strength. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the family dynamic would shift. My brother went from grateful temporary resident to permanent fixture. His kids settled into the local school district. He started referring to it as home in a way that made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it was just semantics. The first red flag should have been when Dad needed a new furnace last winter. I paid the $6,800 without question, but when I mentioned it during a family dinner, my brother made a comment about how I was always throwing money around and making everyone else feel bad. Dad didn't say anything to defend me. The second red flag was when my brother's ex-wife started picking up the kids from their house instead of Grandpa's house. Small changes in language, but they added up. The final red flag was 3 months ago when I showed up unannounced with takeout for everyone and found the front door locks had been changed. My brother claimed it was a security measure after some break-ins in the neighborhood, but he seemed genuinely surprised that no one had given me a new key. Dad mumbled something about meaning to call me about it. I should have seen the writing on the wall then. Update 2. 2 weeks before that text message, I tried to have a conversation with Dad about the long-term arrangement. His cancer was in remission, and while he'd never be able to do physical labor again, he was stable. I wanted to discuss whether the current setup was sustainable or if we needed to make some changes. Dad listened while I explained my concerns. I wasn't complaining about the money. I could afford it, but I wanted some clarity about expectations and boundaries. Was this a temporary arrangement until my brother got back on his feet, or had it become permanent? If it was permanent, shouldn't we formalize it somehow? His response shocked me. He told me that my brother and his kids needed stability after everything they'd been through. He said the house felt like a real home again with children's laughter in it. Then he suggested that maybe I was being too rigid about business arrangements when we were talking about family. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to be mercenary, just practical. The property taxes alone were nearly $700 per month. Add in insurance, maintenance, and emergency repairs, and I was essentially paying rent on a house I couldn't even access without permission. Dad's demeanor changed then. He became defensive, asking if I was threatening to cut off support. He said my brother had sacrificed a lot to move in and take care of him, and that money wasn't everything. The conversation ended with him walking away mid-sentence. I should have known then that something was brewing. Update 3. After receiving that eviction notice screenshot, I did some digging. It turns out my brother had been busier than I'd realized. Through a friend who works at the county clerk's office, I learned that my brother had attempted to file a homestead exemption on the property 6 months earlier, claiming it as his primary residence. The application was rejected because he wasn't the legal owner, but the attempt revealed his intentions clearly. He'd also enrolled his kids in the local school district using the house address as their permanent residence. When I checked the school's website, I found his name listed as the emergency contact and primary guardian, with the house address as their home. Most telling of all, he'd opened a utility account in his own name 3 months ago, taking over the electric and gas bills. I only discovered this when I received a refund check from the utility company for my final month's payment. The picture became crystal clear. This wasn't just about Dad choosing sides or my brother needing temporary help. This was a calculated attempt to establish legal residence and push me out of the picture entirely. Update 4. 2 days after my brother's panicked text about the eviction notice, my phone rang. It was Dad, and his voice was shaking. He asked why I hadn't told him about the tax situation. He said they'd received a notice that the house would be sold at auction in 30 days if the back taxes weren't paid immediately. I explained calmly that I'd sent him the tax notice a month ago, the same day he'd told me not to come around anymore. I reminded him that he'd made it clear the house was no longer my responsibility. He asked if I could loan them the money to cover the taxes. The amount had grown to over $9,000 with penalties and interest. I told him I'd already moved forward with other plans. The truth was, I'd contacted a real estate investor who specialized in tax lien properties. When I'd canceled the auto pay, I'd also researched the legal implications. In our state, if property taxes go unpaid for more than 90 days, the county can begin foreclosure proceedings. But if someone pays the back taxes on behalf of the property, they can acquire a legal interest in it. The investor I'd contacted had a different approach. He offered to buy Dad's equity in the house directly, paying off the back taxes and giving Dad enough cash to relocate somewhere more affordable. It wasn't charity. The house was worth $240,000, and Dad still owed $140,000 on the mortgage. After paying off the loan and back taxes, Dad would walk away with about $85,000. More importantly, the sale would happen quickly, avoiding the public auction and protecting what was left of Dad's credit. Update 5. My brother's reaction to the sale was explosive. He called me screaming about betrayal and abandonment. He accused me of deliberately sabotaging their living situation out of spite. He said his kids would have to change schools and that I was destroying their stability for revenge. I listened to his entire rant without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him a simple question. How much had he contributed to the household expenses over the past 3 years? The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He finally admitted that he'd been planning to buy the house from Dad eventually, once he got back on his feet financially. He said he'd assumed I understood that my financial support was temporary, just until he could take over. I asked him when he'd planned to discuss this arrangement with me, since I'd been paying the bills under the assumption that I was helping family through a difficult time, not subsidizing someone else's real estate acquisition. He had no answer for that. Dad tried to mediate, suggesting we could work something out as a family. He proposed that my brother could start making payments to me to cover the taxes, and I could continue handling them until he got established. I declined. The trust was broken, and I wasn't interested in perpetuating an arrangement where my financial contributions were taken for granted while I was excluded from decisions about the property. Update 6. The house sold 3 weeks later. Dad used his proceeds to buy a small condo in a retirement community about an hour away. It was a smart move for him. The place had medical facilities on site and a community of people his age. My brother had to find an apartment across town. His kids did have to change schools, but they adjusted quickly. He was angry for months, sending occasional texts accusing me of being heartless and vindictive. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd spent 3 years building a life in that house, while I paid for the privilege of being their silent financial partner. When they decided they didn't need me anymore, they'd assumed the money would continue flowing even after they'd shut me out. Final update. Dad and I have rebuilt our relationship slowly. He admitted that he'd felt caught between his sons and had handled the situation poorly. He said my brother had been pressuring him for months to make things official and had convinced him that I was looking for an excuse to stop helping anyway. We have lunch once a month now, and our conversations are more honest than they'd been in years. He likes his new place and has made friends in the community. His health remains stable. My brother and I don't speak. He's still convinced that I orchestrated the whole thing out of spite, rather than simply responding to their decision to exclude me. His perspective seems to be that families should provide financial support without expecting gratitude, communication, or basic respect in return. I've learned something important about boundaries and family dynamics. Love and loyalty can't be one-directional indefinitely. When someone takes your support for granted while actively pushing you away, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let them handle their own consequences. The house sold to a young family with 3 kids. Every time I drive past it, I see toys in the yard and flowers in the garden. It looks like a home again, filled with people who chose to be there together. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just refusing to enable people who don't value what you bring to their lives. Dad learned that family relationships require mutual respect, not just obligation. My brother learned that assumptions about other people's money can be expensive. And I learned that protecting your own peace sometimes means disappointing people who never really considered your feelings in the first place. The last text I received from my brother was 2 months ago. He'd heard through mutual friends that I'd gotten engaged. He wanted to know if his kids would be invited to the wedding. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes.